Hi, welcome to Bookmark. I'm your host, Don Noble. Today's guest is Christopher McIlwain, a practicing Tuscaloosa attorney who has also been studying Alabama in the Civil War for the last 25 years, reading the newspapers of the day, letters, journals, and diaries. The results have been 3 volumes of history: Civil War Alabama, 1865, and a study of the intrigue behind the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. I spoke with Chris McIlwain in Studio UA at the Digital Media Center on the campus of the University of Alabama. Chris, it's nice to see you again.
Good to be here, Don. Thanks for asking.
I have been looking forward to this conversation. You and I have spoken, should we say, informally about your books, but this gives us a chance to talk on camera, on the record, so to speak. This is your first time on Bookmark.
That's
and
right.
Probably not your last, but certainly your first, and our viewers will not know anything about you. Where are you from? Where did you go to school? What is your, essentially, who are your people?
Well, I grew up in Huntsville. My father was the proverbial rocket scientist at NASA in the early years. We got there in 1959, and you know he was working on the booster rocket, which was the big deal about how to get something that heavy up into space. And so he did that through a lot of the 60s. Passed away though, and he was a Tennessee fan, and I was a Tennessee fan, and ended up coming down here to Alabama because we couldn't afford out-of-state tuition. So got here, became an Alabama fan, loved the university, got here in 73, graduated undergrad in 77, and then law school in 1980. And then I practiced law here in Tuscaloosa ever since.
You have been practicing law for more than 25 years.
38.
And you have been working. I have a picture of this, not accurate, I'm certain, but I have a picture of you working in your basement for 25 years, reading Alabama newspapers from 1863. And that's not far off, is it? I mean, that's really what you've been doing.
Well, that was a large part of it. The newspaper review was very extensive and had to be, and I'm glad I did it, but it was so time consuming. And the problem with it is most of those newspapers were on microfilm. You could not, access them online. So it was a matter of going over to Hoole Library after work till 9 o'clock on Tuesdays and Thursdays when they're open. They're not open on weekends for some reason. And going down to the Department of Archives and History in Montgomery. So, but they're only open one Saturday a week, or a month. And so you can imagine how long it took me to go chronologically through all of the Alabama newspapers to find out what people were thinking, what people were saying. Right. Of course, I did the normal thing that all historians do, and that is go through diaries and letters and the official records of the military. And, when you put all that together, and of course, you don't start out with the box on the puzzle where you can look at it and see a piece and go, it goes over here. Uh-huh. You've got to kind of put all those pieces together.
But that box, that metaphorical box, is the previous histories of Alabama in the Civil War. And you did read those, and you found that box not to be satisfactory.
Well, I did. The secondary sources were few and far between as far as being objective. Uh-huh. And you could not even take the books that were out there when I first started and make a timeline of the Alabama experience during the war, what happened each year and that sort of thing. You couldn't do it. And the reason is because those books were written kind of like lawyers write briefs. They will leave stuff out that they don't want and put stuff in. Sometimes they shade the truth, and historians did too.
My conclusion as a reader of your books is that there's one unifying principle, and it is disunity. God, what a sentence that is. Anyway, what Alabamians had been fed for 100 years was that there was a massive patriotic unanimity in 1860. Everybody wanted to secede, and everybody was a Confederate, and everybody went to war, and everybody was in it together. And your two books, both, I would say that was almost a central thesis, that that's not so.
It's not. The old thinking was along the lines of Gone with the Wind. You know, they're in the party at the mansion, and everybody's going war, and all that. That's not the way it was at all.
The actual vote in the legislature for secession?
Well, of course, that's the Constitutional Convention, and it was the lowest percentage of a plus vote for secession of any other state in the South. And a lot of that had to do with you had people in certain parts of the state that were already alienated from the planter class of South Alabama. You know, there were planters in North Alabama, but there were a lot of animosities too.
Was it really about cotton?
Talking about the war and slavery,
Well,
and why the fight,
and the political divisions too. I mean, Alabama divides up into places where one grows cotton and places where one doesn't.
Well, I'm actually researching a book that
Right.
will answer that, but I'll give you the short version of what I've discovered so far is these divisions in Alabama society began before the state was formed. And they had everything to do with land. You know, most of Alabama was owned by the Indians. Well, it was all owned by the Indians at one point, in a sense, and the federal government acquired it by various means. I always tell my Ollie class that we stole it fair and square, and, you know, federal government had all this land to dispose of. And, you know, in an agricultural society, you had to have land to survive. And what the government did was they auctioned off this land, and rather than giving it to settlers if they would come and settle, kind of like the way the West was populated years later. But the government was trying to make sure that the rich got what they needed.
Right.
Well, if you got outbid at an auction sale for that parcel of land that you had already improved, already built a house on, already begun some farming operations, and then you just lose it because, you know, the fat cat comes in and buys it up. A lot of times they weren't going to farm it. They were just speculating. They would buy it and then sell it to you, but at a very high price that you couldn't afford, or it would go to somebody else. So those animosities of class, you know, continued up into past the Civil War.
The one place in Alabama that is famous for not enthusiastically participating in the war was the so-called Free State of Winston. They get a lot of credit for their. They seem to be unique, but they're not. I mean, there's a lot going on all over North Alabama, I'd like to hear a bit about that, but also how much resistance was there? Was there actually guerrilla warfare? And the other thing that intrigued me, different than that, is what we now call the Wiregrass. Seems not to have been a Confederate district either, but I don't know why.
Because those were the poor people too.
But you can't grow cotton in southeast Alabama?
Well, you could, but I mean, most of the South Alabama planters wanted in the Black Belt.
Sure.
Because the land is so fertile and it didn't wear out as quickly as other areas. You know, in North Alabama into the 1850s, because of the destructive farming practices, the land was going to be shot pretty soon. And that's why so many people were moving west to, you know, like Texas, to find new land that was fertile. But, you know, it was ultimately the land was going to go out. But back to your question about Winston County, you know, have you been to Winston County?
Yes.
I mean, it's you know, typical hill country.
Yeah.
And it's where a lot of these people that had been pushed off their lands at an early point, that was the only place they could go and find land. And a lot of them were squatters. So, you know, they had this, you know, this deep-seated generational hatred for a lot of the planter class. Now, not all of them, but that was a prevalent belief. And the Winston County episode, you know, grows out of a meeting that occurred up there.
Right.
Those folks were not just from Winston County. They were from several counties up that way.
Oh, sure. The swath all the way up to Chattanooga.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so, you know, they were basically all they did not secede from Alabama. They simply said, we want to be left alone. And for a while they were.
Right.
The problem started when the Confederacy needed more men and enacted a conscription program that required people to fight, whether they were for the war or not. And
was the war fought to preserve slavery? I suppose that should have been the first question. It always is.
Well, it always is, and you know, every time I speak somewhere, that's the first question from the audience. But slavery was significant, but not in the way that you think, not in the way that a lot of people have been taught. It wasn't the profits from that, believe it or not, for the mass of people, because, you know, in Alabama, only 30% of the families own slaves.
Right.
So what about the 70%?
What about them?
The 70% did not want the slaves to be freed amongst them. They did not believe, and this was a common view around the country, even in the North, is you know, whites could not live with blacks. It was just like whites could not live with Indians. You know, hence the moving the Indians out, is there was going to be an inherent conflict between the cultures, and you know, it was a matter of, you know, abolitionists stay away. You know, we don't want you to trigger a race war, and they knew that could happen because there had been a slave insurrection, huge slave insurrection, on the island of Saint Domingue that we know now as Haiti.
Right.
And you know, the terror of that, the stories about that.
Yeah.
You know, doing that newspaper review, that's one thing I kept seeing, is mention of that.
The rebellion on that island, Haiti and Dominican Republic. By the way, that's the origins of Faulkner's Absalom. Sutpen comes from Haiti. He escapes from Haiti with a bunch of slaves and sets himself up on 100 square miles of land in Mississippi. Yeah. That, one of the things that runs through your first book is, whereas a lot of historians and a lot of lay people interested in the Civil War, and I think of the cause of the Civil War as slavery and greed, you think of it as slavery and fear, including Nat Turner's rebellion, if I'm not mistaken.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, through the years, there would be incidents around the South that were reported across the South that scared people. And, you know, I think Thomas Jefferson said it best for white Southerners. And obviously, I'm not justifying any of this, but his his take was, it's like having the wolf by the ears. You can't keep hold of him, and you can't let him go. So, there was this fear of slaves, rising up and killing everybody
And
the night.
And in the Black Belt, the population percentages were, in some places, 10% white, 90% black?
Right. Hence, the voting power for secessionism was primarily in that area.
Right. Alabama, war starts up, Fort Sumter, everything's rolling along. Huge bloody battles in Virginia, huge bloody battles in Tennessee. So far, so good for Alabama. And your second book, I accidentally read your second book first, 1865, and I thought, my goodness, Alabama almost got away. We almost escaped, essentially, the destruction and the long-term consequences of the Civil War if we had made a separate peace, say, at the beginning of 1865. But we didn't. Why not? The war hadn't come to us yet, so to speak, right?
Well, right. It had come to us in North Alabama. North Alabama was then occupied.
Yeah.
And a lot of the industrial capacity up there had been destroyed. But you still had the industrial corridor between Jefferson County and Dallas County. And it was a broad swath of industrial concerns. And, if we could have escaped with that intact, Alabama would have been number one, in the economic mix of the United States, because the railroad boom was going to start again after the war, and they would need iron, and we had it. And we also had the means of fabricating it. But back to your question, why not?
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of reasons, I'm sure.
There's a man named Thomas Hill Watts who was our governor, and he was fanatical by that point in time. Mm-hmm. He had actually been a pre-war Whig, which Whigs are seen kind of as a moderate segment of the political society here. But by this time, it was, you're going to die in the last ditch to make sure we keep this alive. And, people went down from North Alabama to meet with him to try to convince him that he should cut a deal.
The war was lost. I mean, people could see that, yes?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And, it was just getting worse. You had the effort made in early February for the Confederate government to negotiate with Lincoln and Seward, and that went nowhere simply because Jefferson Davis hamstrung the Confederate commissioners insofar as what they could offer. And what they could offer was independence or nothing. And as a consequence, that went nowhere.
It is fascinating. I don't think most people thinking about the Civil War in Alabama especially understand that we would have been all set for the Industrial Revolution. We would have been Pittsburgh had it not been for the last 6 months of the war. Had Selma especially and Briarcliff and those areas not been destroyed, and that we had an opportunity to ask for a separate peace, but we turned it down, so to speak. Meanwhile, or not meanwhile, but what will happen is the war will get written about by Alabamians. There will be histories written. And one of the things that you suggested was in what terms will Civil War history be couched? It will be military, and it will be chivalric. And the Confederate soldiers, especially Nathan Bedford Forrest, will be Sir Gawain and Lancelot. And the mythology of our Civil War in Alabama is the mythology of King Arthur and his knights fighting for this cause. I don't think it's a noble cause, but it's a cause. That lasted, that lasts, that's still with us?
Still with us.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of that has to do with, I mean, all those topics you just named were great distractions from, you know, the wartime dissension and that sort of thing that actually continued for several decades. You know, if the you know, the Congress had not stepped in to, in essence, require black suffrage, you would have probably had two political parties in the state that were absolutely at loggerheads over, you know, rich versus poor, you know, who got, in essence, screwed during the war and who came out, you know, okay. The wealthy, you know, could afford to put substitutes up.
Well, yeah.
You know, there were just all kinds of battle avoidance techniques used. So, you know, that's where it would be. But afterwards, the imposition of black suffrage solidified a lot of the whites. And, you know, at that point in time, it was if you didn't do your duty during the war, then you brought on this. And so, you know, that was part of the interplay between society here in Alabama afterwards.
So when we write up the history of the Civil War in the years immediately following, we need heroes. The hero Alabama chooses, the person that Alabama historians choose to glorify the most, is Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was probably a slave trader and probably one of the originators of the Ku Klux Klan, and certainly the man in charge at the massacre of surrendered soldiers at Fort Pillow. And his nickname was War Eagle. And people have do people know that is there any connection between Nathan Bedford Forrest's nickname, so to speak? Is nickname the right word for this?
Well, it is nickname. And
the Auburn cry, battle cry?
Well, I'll just say this. A lot of my Auburn friends are not real happy with my reference to that in the book, but you know, I chose to be accurate in there and not leave that out. But most people were unaware that War Eagle was Nathan Bedford Forrest, that was his nickname. Yep. It was a well-known thing throughout the South. If you read the newspapers of that period, you will see references to him as the War Eagle all over the place, in every state. That is what he was called.
I wonder how that happened. I wonder how that transfer got made, if it got made.
I don't know.
No.
I don't know.
You have a third book. The book is finished. It's in galleys at this point, and it's about the assassination of, the connection between the assassination of Abraham Lincoln in Washington and our own Mobile, Alabama, if I'm not mistaken. We have 3 minutes. What is the connection between Alabama and the assassination of Lincoln?
Well, of course, there was an Alabamian that was among the conspirators. Lewis Powell was an Alabamian. You also had some wealthy Alabamians, the leader of whom was a lawyer that lived in Cahaba, named George Washington Gale. Gale, in early 1864, published an advertisement that was reprinted all over the nation, including in the North, you know, soliciting $1 million to have 3 people killed: Lincoln, Johnson, and Seward.
Now that's an enemies list.
It is, and those just happened to be the 3 targets for Booth. Is in essence what it was bounty money. And you know, if you look at the evidence, a lot of people think that Booth was motivated by something Lincoln said, didn't have anything to do with it. If if you look at the evidence, as I did, and there's a book of it that has everything that the government was able to gather, all of them were motivated by money.
And does this plot have? I mean, am I mistaken that there's a Mobile origin to some of this?
Well, the origin, at least chronologically, is Cahaba and Gale. The John Forsyth's Mobile Register publishes a little blurb about this on the front page of its newspaper. And then there is a funding, fundraising effort made in Mobile under the aegis of the Loyal Confederates. And that is a group that Forsyth formed. And what was their goal? To gather $1 million.
I was very interested, and of course, educated. I didn't know who Forsyth was, but apparently Forsyth and the Mobile Register are responsible for tens of thousands of casualties at the end of the Civil War. I also had no idea until I read your first book how many newspapers there were and how powerful they were in shaping public opinion. The Abraham Lincoln book is about to be released. We'll look for it in the next few months, I think.
Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to seeing that. Looking forward to speaking with you again.
Thanks, Don. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure.
A lot of fun.